This video reveals the most disturbing dark psychology ever uncovered, the hidden psychological forces that quietly influence your emotions, your decisions, and sometimes your entire life from the very first moment. Understand this clearly. This is about dark psychology, how it works, and why it's so effective. If you believe manipulation is obvious, if you think you would instantly notice when someone is trying to control you, then this video is already meant for you, because the most dangerous psychological tactics don't feel familiar. They feel safe. They feel like your own thoughts. Dark psychology doesn't announce itself. It doesn't force compliance. It whispers. Instead, it blends into normal conversations, everyday relationships, and ordinary moments. By the time most people realize something is wrong, they're already emotionally invested, already rationalizing behavior they once would have questioned, and in many cases, they're defending the very influence that trapped them in the first place. That is why this topic is so disturbing and why it matters more than most people realize. One of the hardest truths to accept is that dark psychology works not because people are weak, but because the human brain is predictable. The mind is designed to conserve energy. It relies on shortcuts, assumptions, emotional signals, and familiar patterns to make decisions quickly. These shortcuts are useful for survival, but they also create vulnerabilities. Dark psychology takes advantage of those vulnerabilities by guiding people toward conclusions instead of forcing them into actions. When a choice feels self-generated, the brain protects it. When someone believes an idea is theirs, they defend it more strongly than if it were imposed. That's how influence becomes invisibly. Another deeply unsettling truth is that free will often feels stronger than it actually is. Most beliefs aren't consciously chosen. They're absorbed over time through repetition, emotional experiences, authority figures, and social environments. Dark psychology exploits this by attaching ideas to emotions rather than logic. When someone makes you feel understood before challenging you, your mental defenses drop. When approval is followed by criticism, you turn inward instead of questioning the source. When a message is repeated often enough, familiarity begins to feel like truth. The brain prefers what feels easy, and that preference can override critical thinking without you ever noticing. Emotions play an enormous role in this process. Human emotions are contagious. Dark psychology relies heavily on emotional transfer. A calm person can gain authority over someone who feels anxious. A confident voice can override uncertainty. Sudden withdrawal of warmth or attention can trigger panic and self-doubt. Over time, this creates emotional dependency, not because the other person is powerful, but because the emotional system is wired to seek balance and relief. The mind starts chasing stability instead of clarity, and that shift changes behavior in subtle but lasting ways. One of the most damaging effects of prolonged psychological influence is the erosion of self-trust. It rarely begins with extreme behavior. It starts with small dismissals, being told you're overthinking, that you're too sensitive, or that your memory isn't reliable. Slowly, confidence in your own perception weakens. You begin second-guessing your reactions, questioning your instincts, and deferring to external validation. Once self-trust fades, influence no longer needs to be forceful. Control becomes effortless, because the mind is no longer anchored to its own judgment. There is also a psychological mechanism that makes manipulation especially hard to break. It's known as intermittent reinforcement. This is the same process that keeps people pulling slot machine levers. Even when they lose far more than they win, rewards become unpredictable. Affection appears and disappears. Approval is given inconsistently. Moments of connection are followed by distance. The brain becomes focused on the possibility of reward rather than the reality of harm. Instead of seeking happiness, it seeks relief. That cycle creates emotional attachment that feels intense, confusing, and difficult to escape. It's a mistake to assume that only naive or unintelligent people are affected by these dynamics. In reality, dark psychology often works best on thoughtful, empathetic, and self-aware individuals. People who reflect deeply tend to question themselves. They look for nuance. They try to understand intentions. They give others the benefit of the doubt. These traits, valuable, can be exploited by those who understand psychological leverage. Influence doesn't overpower such people. It encourages them to overpower themselves through doubt and overanalysis. Gaslighting is one of the most well-known tactics associated with dark psychology, but it's often misunderstood. It isn't simply lying. It's a gradual of perception through confident denial and repetition over time. Certainty replaces reality. The affected person stops asking whether something is true and starts asking what's wrong with them. That internal shift is where the real damage occurs. Once someone doubts their own perception, external narratives become easier to accept, even when they contradict lived experience. Social environments also play a powerful role in psychological influence. Humans are deeply wired to seek belonging, and the fear of isolation can override logic. Dark psychology uses social proof to normalize behavior and beliefs. When everyone appears to agree, resistance feels risky. When silence is common, questioning feels dangerous. This is how group dynamics can suppress individual judgment, allowing harmful ideas to spread without open challenge. What feels normal becomes unquestioned, and what is unquestioned becomes powerful. Fear and hope are another effective combination. Fear limits options, while hope motivates action. When urgency is added, reasoning shuts down even further. Messages that suggest loss, exclusivity, or limited opportunity can push people into decisions they wouldn't normally make. When time feels scarce, reflection feels irresponsible. Dark psychology uses this pressure not to convince but to rush, knowing that rushed decisions are rarely deeply Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all is that people often defend the very influence that harms them. Admitting manipulation can feel more painful than enduring it. Brain prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar uncertainty. Rationalizing influence becomes a coping mechanism. This isn't a flaw in character, it's a survival response. The mind seeks stability, even when that stability comes at a cost. Awareness is what disrupts these patterns. The moment someone begins to recognize repeated behaviors instead of isolated incidents, influence starts to weaken. Dark psychology relies on emotional reaction. An unexamined repetition. Observation creates distance. Pausing breaks momentum. When emotional responses slow down, control loses its grip. The process doesn't collapse instantly, but clarity creates cracks that widen over time. This knowledge is uncomfortable because it changes how you see the world. Once these patterns are recognized, they appear everywhere in conversations, relationships, media, leadership, and social structures. Awareness alters perception, and perception alters behavior. That's why this subject feels unsettling. It removes innocence, but it also restores agency. The most disturbing dark psychology ever revealed isn't that manipulation exists, it's that it works best when people believe they're immune to it. And now that you've seen how these patterns operate, the real question isn't whether they exist, it's how you move forward with this awareness. What changes when you begin to trust observation over reaction and clarity over comfort? That question matters more than anything else discussed here. If this perspective challenged you, the next video goes even deeper. Understanding psychological influence isn't about fear, it's about freedom. And once you start seeing clearly, there's no going back. Before you click away, understand this: what you just learned was only the surface. Dark psychology doesn't stop at awareness. The real danger begins when these patterns repeat quietly over time in ways most people never notice, and that's exactly what the next video exposes. If this one made you question behavior, perception, or influence, the recommended video takes it a step further by revealing how these tactics evolve, how they adapt, and why they're even harder to recognize once you think you understand them. Don't treat this as separate content, treat it as the missing piece, because once you see how the deeper layers work, everything you thought made sense suddenly clicks into place. The recommended video isn't optional, it's the continuation of this conversation. Watch it now, while this awareness is still fresh.